Good afternoon. I'm Bernadac from the Innovation Strategy and Research Directorate at AFD, and I'm very glad to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us in the room and online. For online participants, do not hesitate to use the chat to raise your comments and questions that we will take during the discussion part. And hope you're all doing great and with us, with a lot of energy still for the rest of the afternoon. We had very insightful discussion this morning and a bit this afternoon in one panel about the need to integrate biophysical variables into our economic model and analysis, and to rethink development pathway within viable space under social and environmental constraints. Therefore, where a society wants to position itself within this viable space with more or less, I would say, degraded frontiers, being it social or environmental, is really a social construct. Therefore, the posture of development within limits or constraint can also be explored through the notion of post-development from a historical, philosophical, and ontological perspective. This session proposed to reflect on post-development from its origin to the analysis of currently dominant social paradigms, including its evolution. Post-development is more defined as a theorization of social movement than a theory per se, defended by thinkers of anti-colonial struggles. This posture questions the relevance of growth for developed countries and, in the South, suggests the reappropriation of identities distorted by colonization. It aims at reinventing a social contract, where the economic, social, and environmental sphere are intertwined, and to interrupt the search for infinite economic expansion posed as incompatible with the finite world or planet we lived in. This perception, therefore, insists on limiting economic, industrial, and demographic growth, pollution, and resource consumption. Currently, trade-offs between SDGs targets tend to favor Goal 8, that is economic growth and employment, in short, over those with social and environmental dimensions. Exploring the notion of development within limit or within this viable space, as we discussed earlier this morning, leads us to search for answers making this policy compass more consistent and redefining pathways that overcome the tendency to prioritize immediate economic benefits over long-term social and environmental ones. Questioning the imposition of a vertical model stemming from the north and largely globalized, and let's say being a bit provocative based on extractivism, overt consumption beyond basic needs, capital concentration, common privatization, and even commodification of larger parts of our life is at stakes. And the aim of this panel is to examine in greater depth, the interdependence between the models of the North and the South, which we have to be coordinated if they are to meet the global challenges. To explore these issues and discuss these matters, we are very honored and grateful to have with us today Dr. Aram Ziai, who will discuss the post-development critique describing development models. Thereafter, Dr. Souleymane Bachir Diagne will dwell on the evolution of the notion and maybe share some thought on why some models tend to become more dominant. And finally, Ms Pearly Wong will share thought on how to reconnect with local knowledge and how to link local issues with global institutions. So first of all, let me give the floor to Dr. Aram Ziai, Chair of Development and Postcolonial Studies, Executive Director of Global Partnership Network, Faculty of Social Science at the University of Kassel in Germany, who will open the discussion by focusing on post-development critique, describing development models, aside from dominant ones, and indicating how they can open more possible futures. Aram, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Carl, for this interesting and insightful introduction. I will share my screen and I hope that the presentation will work. So, can you now see my slides? Okay. So, oh, okay, but you are not seeing the full screen, are you? Okay, so I'll have to do it again. Okay, now? Is it the full screen?
Yeah, coming up.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I will talk about the post-development critique, which provides a fundamental critique of the whole paradigm of development. Now, this is a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And so I will start about the paradigm of development. Now, this paradigm, if we understand it with Thomas Kuhn, is set up by multiple assumptions on different levels. So on the philosophical level, on the meta-theoretical level, on the theoretical level, on the methodological level, and also on the practical level. So all in all, it boils down to the idea that there are developed and less developed societies, and that the industrialized societies are the developed societies, and that there's a universal process, a universal state which can be reached, and that the units of analysis are states or sometimes geographical regions. Now, this paradigm, if you actually have a closer look at it, and if you look at the conflicts in development theory, 95% of the discussion has been taking place within this paradigm. Now, post-development is trying to step out of this paradigm, and the first post-development publications, the prominent publications, appeared in the 1990s. In 1992, the Development Dictionary, which then started with some very polemical assertions, namely that the idea of a development stands like a ruin in the intellectual landscape. The epoch of development is coming to an end. The time is right to write its obituary. And Gustavo Esteva added insultingly that development is an unburied corpse spreading every kind of pest. Now, how did they arrive at this extremely negative evaluation? Now, through 5 main arguments, I would say. The first argument being that there has been an invention of underdevelopment. Of course, the concept of development has longer roots in history, but post-development argues that the program of developing the underdeveloped regions has been invented in 1949 in the inaugural address of US President Truman, where he announced a program for the development of the underdeveloped regions. And here we see that post-development is treating development as a discourse, a historically situated way of representing the world, which is linked to the relations of power. Now, this historical context had specific effects, and the historical context was, above all, the Cold War and the anti-colonial struggles. And these factors made a new kind of relation to the Global South necessary from the perspective of the United States and, in general, the West. And Truman outlined this with this new program of development. And in this announcement, he said that the poverty of the less developed should not only be reduced for humanitarian reason, but also because it is a threat and a handicap to the more prosperous regions, that is, the United States. And he was very clear on denouncing the old imperialism, that is, colonialism, but envisioned a program of development based on democratic fair dealing, which would also benefit the US economy, the US industry. Now, here we have the idea and which is at the very root of this concept, that there is no contradiction between the interests of investors from the global north and the poor in the global south. And this is something we can still encounter until today, although the claims for this assumption are based on very meager empirical evidence. Now, development thus can be described as a program to legitimate the capitalist world order in the global south through the promise of affluence, the promise of development. You can be developed, you can become like the developed countries within a few decades. Now, the aim obviously being to maintain access to the resources and the markets of the global south in a post-colonial era. So here we are now confronted with a new perception of international relations and identities in which the majority is being defined as underdeveloped. And this is denounced as an invention, as a matter of perception. Esteva and others criticize that human diversity is being reduced to catching up with the West, as if this was the only way of achieving a good society. Core argument number 2 is then directly directed at economics. I hope there are no economists present. So economics is being generally regarded not as a hard science, but in the words of Arturo Escobar, as a cultural discourse. Now, what do they mean by that? First of all, that good life is being identified with material wealth, so that progress can be measured through material wealth. And then that the discipline of economics does not differentiate between two types of poverty, frugality and destitution. While the one can be described as a situation where people have little income, little cash money, but access to basic needs in the form of subsistence agriculture or access to water or access to commons, which can be used to make a living. And from this, they differentiate a situation of destitution, where basic needs are not being satisfied. And they argue that this situation mainly came about only after the advent of colonialism and capitalism in the global south. So the difference then being obviously both types of situation being characterized by lack of income, however, one with very different consequences on basic needs than the other. Now, from this basic situation of a subsistence agriculture, they argue that the modern economy sees this as a problem to be solved by economic growth. And this economic growth is then also linked to the production of goods, and the production of goods would then satisfy human needs. Now, post-development argues, however, that this law of scarcity, that there's always a scarcity of goods, was a construction, a social construction of economists, which could not process the fact that maybe people would be content with the number of goods that they had. So the idea of sufficiency is something that does not appear in these constructions of the economists according to post-development. Now, here they argue that the production of ever new needs, which can only be satisfied through the market, is linked to the mechanisms of capitalism itself. And they argue as well that the spread of this type of thinking and this model of society has devalued other forms of knowledge, production, and exchange. For example, also the productivity of nature. Vandana Shiva, for example, points to the fact that a stable and clean river is, in the perspective of economics, not a productive resource in itself, only if it is developed with dams or if its water or its fish can be sold on the market. So core argument number 3, development as an amoeba. Now, they argue that through numerous redefinitions of development. Basically, nowadays, anything can be designated as a development project or as contributing to development, from infrastructure to structure adjustment programs for biodiversity compensation, empowerment, or education for girls. And this, they argue, has made the concept shapeless. So one cannot really pinpoint what it means when someone talks about development in the global south. And this, as mentioned, has been achieved through numerous new and redefinitions, which also have led to misunderstandings, as has been argued in the development dictionary as well, that socialist guerrilla fighters in, for example, Colombia, and IMF staff in the United States both would agree that development is a good thing, but of course they would have vastly differing ideas of what exactly is meant by that. Now, talking about these redefinitions, it has also been remarked that the superiority of the Western model in economic growth and the legitimation of interventions have been constant features despite these numerous redefinitions. Now, these redefinitions could be described as a cycle of the development promise, starting in the 1949 with the diagnosis of a deficit. Oh, there's a lot of poverty and misery in the world. But now we have the means to do something about it, the promise of development and the precise recipe and the strategy, industrialization, modernization, economic growth, and transfer of technology and investments, which would then lead, however, to a failure, because at the end of the 1960s, already in the United Nations Persons Report, it was clear that the poorer sections of the societies of the Global South had not benefited from this process of development. However, this led merely to a new diagnosis of deficit in terms of World Bank experts arguing, oh yes, it did not quite work, but we know why. We have not sufficiently focused on social development, on rural development, on the basic needs. So a new promise was given, new recipes, new strategies, new projects and programs, new failures. Then it was again a new diagnosis which came up on, okay, yeah, we had actually not taken into account sufficiently the role of women in economic development. You remember the best-selling book by Esther Boserup, The Role of Women in Economic Development. New promise, new recipe, new failure. Then it was participation. Then it was the role of the market. Then it was good governance. Then it was sustainability. Then it was microcredits. You name it, the development industry always comes up with a new diagnosis which allows for a new promise. However, this cycle of the promise reaffirms every time the competence of the experts to formulate policies despite previous failures by discovering new aspects of the object in need. So what is wrong is something in the societies of the Global South itself. Now, the elephant in the room here is global capitalism. Is it possible at all to achieve development for everyone based on a system of global capitalism? This question has hardly been posed, at least in development policy circles. In development theory, of course, some people have been discussing this. Now, post-development's argument number 4. If you're wondering what this is an anti-gravity machine on the image. Only a prototype. So the anti-politics machine has been a 4th argument, and this refers now precisely to development agencies, arguing that they favor technical solutions and ignore political conflicts, which are at the root of problems of inequality. James Ferguson has argued that by uncompromisingly reducing poverty to a technical problem, the hegemonic problematic of development is the principal means through which the question of poverty is depoliticized in the world today. And he argued thereby that development agencies were unable to recognize the relations of power at the root of relations of inequality, because they were not in the position to do something about it. Because development agencies that basically meddle into politics are kicked out of the country usually relatively quickly, and they rightly argue it is not our business to meddle in politics. What we offer are technical solutions: transfer of knowledge, transfer of capital, transfer of projects. And this, according to Ferguson, however, is misguided, so that the apparatus of development, first of all, constructs problems as solvable without changing relations of power. So trying to help the poor without stepping on the toes of the rich, without changing these relations of power, which is a very difficult endeavor, which is why the results are, well, as they are. And secondly, the development agencies would cast themselves as non-political, but perform operations with a political dimension, namely transferring funds to the government or bringing the government to economic reforms, which then also had political repercussions. So, so this is a quote where Ferguson actually relates an anecdote about a developer from the Canadian agency SIDA, who said, "Okay, what could we have done? You said from the beginning that we're actually not doing it right. So how could we do it right?" And then he's argued, "Okay, well, the people you're trying to help in Lesotho have been earning the greater part of their income as migrant workers in the mines of South Africa, and the wages are terrible there because there are no unions allowed. So you might pressure your government so that they should pressure South Africa that they would allow union organizing." To which the development expert predictably replied, no, I mean development. We cannot afford to meddle with politics. So politics and development are seen as two different areas, apparently. So last argument, the end of the development era. This is what post-development has been arguing already in the 90s. Well, the MDGs have proven them wrong, apparently. And they were arguing that the ecological predicament had made it abundantly clear that the lifestyle of the developed countries cannot be universalized, because we would need 3 or 4 planets for the resource consumption. Second point, the end of the Cold War. Now, if the Cold War and decolonization gave birth to this concept of development, one might think that the end of Cold War might make development aid in the sense of bribing the South superfluous. During the 90s, this point had some credibility, but as mentioned, from the 2000 onwards, well, this did not quite come to pass. Third point, they argue that development in the sense of transforming the underdeveloped countries into developed ones has certainly been a failure. Now, arguing, of course, here in terms of relative poverty, not of absolute poverty. One can certainly discuss this. And the last point, more and more people would realize that development would be a homogenizing concept, which would amount to westernizing the world. Here we can also see that many protests against this have been arising. Now, on the basis of all of this, post-development is arguing that we need to find alternatives to development. Now, by this, they mean alternatives to conceptualizing global inequality and social change according to this paradigm that I've been mentioning in the beginning. And they argued, now this is not something that some clever thinkers in the universities should come up with, but they argued that these alternatives to development are being observed or can be observed already in social movements in the South. However, they were stressing the point that it is not about one alternative. That first of all, the alternative development that we would be witnessing was more or less an alternative way to become a modern society, instead of looking for alternatives to this hegemonic model that the West was trying to universalize in the first place. Now, here, it is not about one alternative, but about a pluriverse of alternatives, or in the words of the Zapatistas, a world of many worlds. So explicitly rejecting the idea that some people, some experts, even some post-development experts, might know how the world should be designed differently. So post-development was arguing that the self-organized ways of living were to be observed in the Global South as a result of being excluded by the project of development. So basically, after subsistence agriculture had been destroyed by blocking access, for example, to commons, people were rushing into the city, where, however, the promises of development did not come to pass, and where people, therefore, as a reaction to this failure, started to organize themselves reclaiming the commons, reclaiming also some cultural traditions, looking for hybrid models between these traditions and modernity, and reclaiming politics, the economy, and knowledge.
Aram, sorry,
Now,
we need to reach to the conclusion and give some room to
yeah,
discussion after. Thank you.
yes, I'm sorry for stretching the time. This is the last slide, so the final slide is soon to come. So I'll be brief. So they were referring to the Chipko movement in India, to the Zapatista movement, to some others. Later also to Buen Vivir in Bolivia and Ecuador. One could also point to less progressive, non-Western, anti-Western alternatives like Al-Sadeghi in Iran. But one could also point to Rojava and the Democratic Confederalism. So my conclusion that what could we now draw from these post-development approaches? First of all, the very basic insight that Western model of society is certainly one among many and not necessarily offers the superior solution. So we could look into the South, ask what can we actually learn from the South here in the North, especially when it comes to questions of sustainability. The classification of underdeveloped, entailing relations of power is the second conclusion, that we need a different frame for perceiving global inequality should be clear as a consequence of post-development. Now, some have been offering exploitation as a global frame, and if we're now talking about new ideals instead of striving for development, the pluriverse would then suggest terms like self-determination, solidarity, justice, degrowth, and hospitality. So thanks for your attention. This is my literature, and I submit.
Thank you very much, Aram. Now let me give the floor to our second speaker, Dr. Souleymane Bachir Diagne, philosopher and professor of philosophy and French at Columbia University, who will give us his vision of this concept of post-development, dwelling on the evolution of the notion over time and its representation and links with the economy and education. He will also explain, with a particular focus on Africa, why some models tend to become more dominant or attractive than others, and how social structures and superstructures can evolve. Souleymane, la parole est à vous pour une vingtaine de minutes. Merci beaucoup.
Je vous remercie infiniment. Good morning, everybody in Paris and online, and thanks to the organizers for having me on this panel devoted to post-development. Actually, the reason why I was greeted in French is that I announced that my presentation would be in French, but I would hate myself for breaking the consensus. So I will just improvise an English translation of a presentation that I wrote in French. So Pierre, please bear with me if I turn myself into an improvised deep L translator at this point. So my question is, what does the post in post-development mean? I would say that on the one hand, post means that we need to break away from development. And on the other hand, post means that we need to open alternative to development. So I will have a very simple structure. First of all, looking at post-development as rupture, and then post-development as opening. And I will start with this simple fact that the concept of post-development really gained currency in the 1990s. An important marker of that being the book of the anthropologist, Colombian anthropologist Pablo Escobar, Encountering Development, that Aram Ziai just quoted. In the middle of the 1980s, we saw the application in developing countries, so-called developing countries, of all these programs of stabilization and structural reform, all the structural adjustment programs as they are known. I could not obviously discuss the result of the structural adjustment programs, but in order to understand fully the context within which the idea of post-development gained currency, we can agree on the social outcome of these structural adjustment programs and agree that these outcomes were disastrous for many countries. To enumerate a certain number of consequences, we could talk about unemployment, the decrease of social expenditures, of social protection, and just the explosion of poverty. So the context was that the sentiment grew that one was not talking about development anymore, but just palliative measures such as adjustment or fighting against poverty. And in that climate of disenchantment, the concept of post-development did gain currency. It gained currency because the genealogy, the very genealogy of the concept was more and more questioned. And this is something that Aram Ziai also developed. And that genealogy is without doubt a colonialist genealogy. One could retrace the origins of the word looking back at the notion of a mission of so-called superior races that have the mission of pulling inferior races. This was the language of colonialism, and it was an evolutionist language. And that same language remained when the terminology changed and became the terminology of primitive societies versus advanced societies, or less advanced societies versus advanced societies. You can also read the same evolutionary and evolutionist language in the opposition between modern societies and traditional societies. So we have all these conceptual couples translating the same evolutionist language. So it is understandable that at the end of such a chain of concepts, one would find developed versus underdeveloped societies. Underdeveloped, which was turned into developing societies, a way of saying that one is not talking about the essence of these societies, but a kind of transitory state of those societies that would be still on the path towards the state achieved by other advanced, so-called advanced societies, but a unilinear path. Every single society has to go through the same stages. So in its very construction, the concept of post-development is meant to be a rupture with such a semantic field, evolutionist semantic field that I just described very quickly. Now, that being said, we could raise the following question. why is semantics so important? After all, if the genealogy of the concept is the one that I just retraced, words do have origins, they do have genealogies, they do have etymologies, but what is more important is their current uses. So one could say, why do you just criticize the way in which the action of developing societies is named instead of looking at the action itself? So one that would be the idea that you can just detach the words that we use to think about our action from the action itself. This is not an abstract or philosophical question. The answer to that is that the words we use, the concept itself, actually functions as an epistemological obstacle when the point is to think about the action. So the object of the critique carried by the notion of post-development is that evolutionist, linear evolutionism obfuscates the reality of the link that explains why underdevelopment is a consequence of the very structure of a word which is divided as Léopold Sédar Senghor, Senegalese statesman and poet and thinker, used to call the order in French, l'ordre de l'injustice qui régit les rapports entre le Nord et le Sud, the order of injustice defining the relationship between North and South. And here, what Senghor is saying is the following. Let's not just consider this situation as a given division between a North that is rich and a South that is underdeveloped or developing. A situation that would be then seen, thought of, and maybe dealt with in strictly economic terms. For Senghor, the foundation, the very foundation of this order of global injustice is primarily cultural and only secondarily economic. Here we could not talk about economy being the infrastructure and culture being the superstructure, because for him, the real order of things goes the other way around. The infrastructure is what he calls cultural contempt. And the superstructure is the continuation of an unjust global economic order. He did not ignore the economic aspect of things. On the contrary, he adopted the viewpoint of these pioneers of what is known as the Latino-American school of structuralist economy, namely the Raúl Prebisch or Singer as well. And following their lead, the lead of these Latin American economists, Senghor popularized under the expression of détérioration des termes de l'échange, deterioration of the terms of trade, the thesis known as the Singer-Prebisch thesis on unequal exchange, a thesis according to which the price of rare products decreases vis-a-vis the price of manufactured products in the long run, condemning the terms of trade of economies based on raw products to continuously deteriorate. So underdevelopment and dependency are inscribed in the very structure of global capitalism. This is something that Aram also mentioned, as denounced today by social forum and philosophy and of alter-mondialist, alter-globalist philosophy and movement. So for Senghor, the structure of the word is not the necessary consequence of blind economic mechanism, but the result of what he called cultural contempt. So speaking precisely of culture, another aspect that make the evolutionist thought of development an epistemological obstacle is that it leads towards an internalization of the idea that one has to be like developed societies, understanding development as imitation and conformation to an external model. And this is very important even psychologically, because it leads to the idea that what prevents you, underdeveloped, from being like us, developed, is what precisely makes you different. Your difference is the problem. Your culture is a problem. And it is not coincidental that the period of structural adjustment programs is the period that have witnessed the development of so-called Afro-pessimism, the notion that the very cause of underdevelopment are Africans themselves. The idea that Africa needs a cultural adjustment, the phrase has been used in the 1990s. And you have this emblematic book that had been published by Axel Kabou, Et si l'Afrique refusait le développement? This idea that maybe Africa is refusing development because it is Africa. And this book, published in 1999 by Axel Kabou, became very famous and widely read and praised as a way of at last speaking the truth to the Africans. Once you start something, a sentence like, let's not be politically correct, you are going to say usually horrible things. And this is how this book was saluted in a way as speaking the truth to these Africans, manifesting that notion, Senghorian notion, that the foundation, the ultimate foundation, is what he called cultural content. Now I go quickly to the second part, shorter part of my presentation about post-development now as a force of proposition, opening. It is precisely around the discourse of culture that the concept of post-development has a value as proposition and not just criticism and refusal of development. And it is not coincidental that the main authors are anthropologists, actually, or economists who are very who are emphasizing social parameters, social-cultural parameters. A common denominator in the different approaches of authors identified with post-development, they insist that there is not such a thing as conforming yourself to an external model. And they insist on the indigenous nature of any kind of development. And I would like to quote here a historian from Burkina Faso, Joseph Kizerbo, who used an African proverb saying that you can't really sleep all the time on somebody else's mattress. Also, he coined this declaration, famous declaration, on n'est pas développé, on se développe. One is not developed, one develops oneself. Because post-development insists on culture, on agency, internal agency, and also on cooperation, South-South cooperation, and sustainability as an answer to that line of injustice that Senghor mentioned. Now, is this simple cultural relativism? The criticism has been actually produced, saying, are we saying each culture has their own model of development? No, but the principle is here to make the best of the culture itself and the knowledge that they carry and produce. First of all, the question is to be attentive to what Enda in Senegal used to call urban popular economies, preferably to informal sector, which is a more current phrase about that, because the so-called informal sector is also depository of creativity and culture. So we could discuss that. Second, the point is to emphasize the importance of the cosmologies of the living, to emphasize the inscription of the human within nature with other living beings. And it is in that sense that the African cosmologies can constitute an example to just think about the relationship with nature that has not relations of predation and destruction. Aram Ziai mentioned the Cartesian model of being master and possessor of nature, as Descartes famously said, could be counterbalanced today with cosmologies of the inscription of the human within nature and not the human being an empire within an empire, to speak the language of Spinoza. We see this in South American societies today when people are trying to think about the rights of environmental rights, for example, the right of a river not to be polluted, etc. So we have there, and this is an aspect of post-development, cultural elements that should be able to nurture a reflection on development. Having said that, having insisted on these cosmologies of solidarity with the living, I don't think that the goal is to romanticize culture. We should not be romanticizing culture. And this is not fundamentalist culturalism in a way. It is just insistence on endogeneity, agency, and insistence on having one's own agenda, not enclosed in some kind of philosophy of cultural identity, but open to a philosophy of becoming. It is less about identity than about becoming. And in that sense, yes, importance should be recognized. We should acknowledge the importance of anthropology in the question of development, but prospective anthropology, to give it all its importance and its role to women and the youth, for example, speaking of a continent like Africa. So post-development is about this project, open-ended and continuous project, to think about the situations and the problems of today in relation to what French perspective calls les futuribles, the futures that we are hoping for. In other words, we are not talking about traditional societies understanding that all their action is dictated by the tradition, by their identity, by who they are, but prospective thinking means that your actions today are dictated by the vision you have of your own future. So this is what I try to define as prospective anthropology. Last point to end with that, on which post-development is insisting, cooperation, South-South cooperation, which is very important. Of course, when it comes to having one's own agenda, vision and action, and not just imitating an external model. Speaking of Africa, I think that ZLEDCAf is the most important decision that has been taken in Africa since independences, because you can just bet on the future of a truly African agenda that would be that would have the project of developing horizontal relations between African countries. They have been integrated in globalized capitalism through an extractivist model where the centers in the north imposed in a vertical way to the peripheries their own economic choice. Many examples can be looked at. So this verticality of the integration into global capitalism is what a cooperation South-South and the model of Zletkaf in Africa would mean, breaking away from the continuation of the so-called colonial pact through which African countries were related in a vertical way to global markets without thinking about the development of horizontal relationship between these countries. This did not happen during the colonial period, and that is true. Colonialism has invested maybe in railroads going from mines to ports, for example, or capitals, but did not invest in infrastructure really relating the other localities in a country, because simply this was not immediately profitable. So colonialism has invested very little in infrastructure, and as a continuation, aid, so-called aid, development aid, for a long time also has turned its back on infrastructure and investments in infrastructure. So this idea of having an African agenda in the first place and having Zletkaf and trying to develop horizontal relations is to say that the priority would be precisely that, to create a truly integrated space that would be given then to the agency of the populations. And that is probably the most important point about this cooperation, South-South cooperation, translated on the African continent as Zletkaf. The question not being to delink yourself with global capitalism, but to be part of the global world more on your own terms, with your own agenda, or at least with a growing power of negotiation. So hopefully I've been able to improvise a rough translation of my text in French, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Souleymane, for this very insightful thought you shared. And we will certainly come back to this notion of emancipation from dominant model and South-South cooperation, building own agenda without insulation. And so let me now give the floor, introduce the third speaker, Mrs. Pearly Wong, ethnographer and doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin Madison, who will develop how to connect expert and local knowledge, how to decolonialize representations and development work, and lastly, how to connect local issues with global institutions. She will also lay emphasis on her research work conducted in Nepal. Thank you, Pearly. The floor is yours for about 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. So I'm really glad to be part of this panel because I feel like we are speaking with each other. I certainly hope that I am part of the prospective anthropology that Souleymane just mentioned. We will see. The title of my presentation today is Beyond Post-Development, From Theory to Practice. And the reason I talk about beyond post-development is what Aram had already mentioned, that even though that post-developmentalists envision the end of development, but it didn't really happen, and development is still there, and is ever stronger, if one can argue. And also, when I learned about ideas of post-development, I was very fascinated by it. I thought it was very insightful. But I also came from an international development background. I have worked with international development agencies for a few years before coming to US to do my PhD. And I just felt like when I think back to the people, to the community partners that I actually work with, I felt like maybe we need to move a little bit beyond post-development in the sense of, if I understand post-development to be strictly about rejecting development and focusing on alternative that is separate from the hegemonic structure, which is what Souleymane was arguing a little bit against at the end of his presentation that we are actually part of it. So my point here is we actually really need to link the local to global. And because development is really not an opposition between local and global. Local people are already embedded in the global. They are not separate from it, or they are not necessarily just resisting it. It's more complicated than that, right? It's all mutually shaping. And also another point is development and unequal power structures are not disappearing overnight. Development as an industry has been there, and it will be there for the foreseeable future. And most importantly, people, when I say people, I mean community members on the ground, rural people, all the societies that I have been with and I have worked with, they aspire development. Well, what development means to each of them might be different, but they believe in the idea of development. Like what Aram just said is an amoeba, and it's an internalized thing. And so development as an amoeba can be a criticism, but it can also be an opportunity because people can still frame their own agenda using the term development. And development and sustainability discourses are not monolithic and universally imposing. From my own observation, they actually help people at the local level to reshape their thoughts. And I will give you an example about sustainability discourses later in my case study. And it is useful for people to build networks, to mobilize resources and engage power holders, right? By having the same languages, right? You can tell your government or whoever, people with resources who already sort of officially endorse the discourse that you are doing the same thing as the discourses are promoting, right? So participation in development and sustainability discourses help claiming resources dedicated to the global level for SDGs, right? So now I will go into talking about my case here in Pharping in Nepal, and I want to really talk about how people understand and practice sustainability from a bottom-up perspective with this case study. And before that, I want to just give a very brief background so that later the meaning of sustainability and practice of sustainability will make sense to you. So Nepal, at a very quick glance, so it has centuries of autocratic ruling and Hindu caste system and Hindu patriarchy. And before 1950s, there was almost a complete absence of any public services because of the sumptuaries law that makes education and material consumption an exclusive privilege to the royal elites. And then after 1950s, in the year 1950, there was a democratic movement, but within 10 years, the power was recaptured by an autocratic power. But then since 1950, there has been development intervention at the very beginning of development as an industry or as a notion proposed by Truman in the US, President Truman. Development intervention has happened in Nepal because at the time, frankly, it was seen as an important place not to be influenced by communism because Nepal was just located right by China. And then there's a second democratic movement in the year 1990. And then after the second democratic movement, nobody captured power. It can be called a democracy now, however you want to define it. But after the democratic movement, in the year 1996, actually a 10-year civil war took place in the country because of really long-standing inequalities caused by caste hierarchy and also gender inequality. And then in 2015, they have a new federal constitution and the monarchy was also abolished permanently. And then today, Nepal has a very high migration rate for education and labor opportunities. And you can see a lot of literature about how that has caused negative consequences in some of the rural area due to the emigrations of useful human resources. And then it is aid and remittance dependent, especially aid money peaked after 2015 earthquake. And then the community I work with, they call themselves the Shikarabo community, and they're located in Dachingali, about 20 kilometers away from Kathmandu, which is the capital of Nepal. And they have been operating education programs for over 2 decades. And these are just some of the entities that they have. They established their own Chicago Community College to offer bachelor degrees, their own community school, their own community learning center, which house open school, meaning school that gives education to school dropouts, and a women's school, and then farmer school, the famous border house, which I will show you pictures later. And then associated with the community are some other entities, like there's a foundation called Rukmini Foundation, which is actually established by family members who already migrated to the US, and they have been organizing fundraising to provide money for development back in the Chicago community. Okay, so now I will mostly show you some of the quotations of people I work with to show you what sustainability mean to them, or what the sustainability practice looks like, right? And I will also, maybe characterize each of those quotations with one observation, right? So the first observation I have here is the meaning of sustainability is rooted in local context, but it is changing following national and global processes. So the first quotation here about child marriage, he said, since I had a child marriage myself, I felt very bad and hurt that I could not continue my study. I was thinking other children should not face similar situations. And whenever I see girls, I always advise them to continue their education. Rukmini Foundation is working for girls' education. That's why I love this work very much. And then the second quotation, people only evaluate physical, financial, and decide this is developed or underdeveloped, but that is not true. It should be about attitude and behavior and how to help each other. If development makes poor and rich people, it is not a developed society because the attitude is false and that is discrimination. So both of them are really talking about inequalities and discrimination, and that is rooted in the context of the country where there is a centuries-old caste system and also Hindu patriarchy system. But they also came to this realization because of changing national politics, right? So the second quotation is by an old man who is like 70 years old. So he has gone through all the turmoil of political history in the country, and definitely the Maoist Civil War that asked for equality, right? And also after development interventions, slowly in the recent decades, there are education for all, inclusive education. So all those things are part of the background that informs these thoughts by my informants. And then in the second column to your right-hand side, in more recent years, there is a change of emphasis from access to education to relevance of education. So I read here, since 2015, we have maximum people going out to foreign countries, doing a lot of small jobs. Some students are not good academically and cannot proceed beyond grade 10. That's how we started to think about farmer school. They can learn technical and agricultural skill in the border house, so they will be discouraged to go to foreign countries for low-paid jobs. Our farmer school is using a concept of teaching farmers in the field. All our trainings are practical, hands-on. Yesterday, there was a Vietnamese visitor who taught how to make organic fertilizer to our students. So even if students are not farming themselves, they have some kitchen gardens and they will be able to use some fertilizers. We are hoping to link agriculture to business as well to support self-employment. So before that, before the migration trend happens, people were just thinking about assessing education. But now, because all the young people are leaving, including the college students, they're thinking that, oh, we need some kind of education that are actually practically relevant, enable people to live in the country context. So, okay, this is the border house that I mentioned. It is made of waste glass bottle and with infrastructure such as greenhouses surrounding it, a composting toilet, solar power bathroom, etc. And the second observation that I want to talk about here is sustainability efforts draw from translocal ideas and resources. So ideas and resources that's beyond local. So I'll give an example of this border house farmer school project. So the border house idea is actually from an American architect who built a model in somewhere else in the Kathmandu Valley. And people from the Chicago saw that house and they thought of they want to replicate that because they don't have too much money to create a conventional concrete building. And they think that an environmental friendly building could be an inspiration for others. So they managed to connect with the American architect, Bill Hutchinson from University of Maryland. And then he actually flew over to help them build this house. And then the surrounding infrastructure, as I mentioned, composting toilet, solar power bathroom, they are all actually recommended by Madan Rai, which is a Nepali, but a returning professional migrant who used to work with FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. Now Madan started his own agricultural school in Kotang. And he came to visit Chicago to exchange some knowledge about providing non-formal education. So that's how they get all these ideas. And then, as I mentioned about Rumini Foundation, they are donations by families who already migrated abroad that give resources to support the operation of these schools. And then there's also multiple learning trips by the manager of the school, Niroj, to Japan. And the first learning trip was because of UNESCO. So UNESCO was promoting the idea of community learning centers. So they sent Niroj as a representative in Nepal to go to Japan for a conference. And then through that conference, Niroj built relationship with a Japanese NGO. And this is completely out of UNESCO. It's their own organically built relationship. And then they have this horizontal learning relationship that you can see that the Japanese NGO comes to Nepal a couple of times to visit and to support agricultural expertise. And then Niroj was also brought to Japan to learn about the cottage industries there. And then through the word of mouth, because of the good things that the committee has been doing for decades, a European NGO from Luxembourg actually learned about it and then provided funding since 2017 until now to support the operation of the farmer school. And then also the sixth here is award and grant application support by international friendships. So I can give myself as an example. I help them to apply various grants. I help them to apply various awards. I try to understand what they want to do. And then I use some of the languages that I think could appeal to the global donors. And then I wrote those and then they won some of those. Okay, and the third point here I want to mention is sustainability efforts require intergenerational learning and transformation. And I will just go right into the quotation because I think they are very insightful. So sustainability is intergenerational learning transformation. We Newari, which is an ethnicity in Nepal, for example, have practices of sustainability. Newari houses are sustainably managed. The bricks were made by ourselves with mud. We also use wood, bark, all are made by local skilled people. But the knowledge has not been transferred from generation to generation because of westernization. We need some research on how to improvise our knowledge and attract the new generation. In a way, our organic composting is an idea in revision. We used to compost in pits in our kitchen. It is the same process and we're just improving the style and design, making it easy. We need to think about houses like that. And then another quotation. We think that the community itself is a school for everyone. There are at least 3 generations present within the community and they hold different knowledge and experience. Every teacher is a learner and every learner can be a teacher. In Nepal, too much emphasis has been given to formal education and getting accreditation. However, we believe that experiences and knowledge of our immediate surrounding is more important, and that every individual can have such knowledge. For instance, our elderly mothers have knowledge on rituals and some indigenous skills like weaving grass mats. And I will give another external example, not from the community. So in Nepal, there's a very famous eye surgeon called Samdut Rui, and he has developed a cataract surgery that use only a few dollars for every surgery and in a mobile clinic using his vehicles. And he is trained, Westernly trained as in modern medicine, but he was able to adapt it to the context of Nepal, which is very mountainous and a lot of villages are very remote with no electricity and people really have no money and cannot afford expensive surgery. So he was famous because of that, because he developed a surgery that actually works for rural people and helps hundreds and thousands of people. And there are actually a lot of visitors from Thailand, Africa, and other places that came to learn from him. Okay, and the final observation here is sustainability efforts support localization without rejecting foreign resources, technology, and participation in the market. So the first quotation here, When I first made bachelor level college in the community, I was very happy and thought that I have made changes in the community. But then after 1 year, I started to think, if they pass bachelor degrees, what will they do? And our education effort needs constant donation. Donation equals domination. So why don't we run our farmer school to get money for students, give income for community project, no need to raise fund all the time and have community businesses. So they're talking about generating financial resources via participation in the market and producing their own produce. And then the second quote here, to live on this earth, we need to sustain agriculture and teach young people that we have to be professional in agriculture by knowing recent technology and scientific system. For instance, lapsi, which is a special fruit that's only available in the region. Lapsi is produced in this very specific region in the Hill County. We can capitalize on this uniqueness. I was suggesting for the farmer schools to use and distribute 10,000 lapsi grafted plants. We can start our own lapsi candy manufacturing. Because I care about sustainability, I must make sure to show that agriculture can be profitable. In order to convince young people to stay back rather than going abroad, in agriculture, people don't want to do hard labor, so we try to apply technology to keep them interested. For example, solar power tiller or grass cutter. So they feel good when they are using machines rather than hands, and they are also saving time and earning money. So all these, they are all trying to retain human resources, retain young people, cultivate local resources and use them, lapsi, agriculture, and also generate financial resources. So this is my last slide. To recap, what do sustainability-related efforts look like in practice for this community, right? The first, adaptation to changes guided by people, cultural, and historical experience. So people go through periods of discrimination, inequalities, and migration. And the ideas of what is sustainable, what is development are changing due to these processes. And then it involves translocal, or you can call interspatial learning and resources. It is not purely local. It involves exchange with people either in the nearby village, nearby countries, or all the way across the world. And intergenerational learning and transformation, and also localization, maintaining existing local resources and cultivating new ones without rejecting foreign resources. And as an former international development professional, so I provide some very basic recommendations that I think development practitioners and agencies can do, right? The first is investing in creating a learning environment where within communities, and support learning by doing opportunities such as funding pilot programs. Investing in building horizontal networks, I should emphasize, and promoting horizontal knowledge exchange among communities from different places. So a lot of agencies are in a very good place to do this. Like they have agencies all around the world, and they know different community partners, and they can bring them together. And bridging local agenda with international priorities, working closely with community partners to translate local needs into global discourses. And I would say to take advantage of the polysemic nature, the vague nature of the word sustainability or development, which has been a criticism, but could be taken as an advantage by communities worldwide to reclaim them. And using existing discourses on indigenous knowledge, indigenous rights, cultural heritage, entrepreneurship development, whatsoever, to promote intergenerational learning towards transformation. So it's not just about learning traditional knowledge, but also how to adapt it to attract new generations. And then investing in programs that cultivate and retain local, human, natural, and financial resources. Okay, my last slide is summary, provide network and resources, not experts and programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pearly. So I guess I will have to ask for maybe 2 days more of conference to be able to debate all these questions. And given reading some comments, yes, we are dwelling into very insightful points of questioning the circle of new diagnoses, new promises, but how do we escape from global capitalism questions and so forth? What is the roles of development agencies? And I'm glad that we can question that from Development Agency International Conference. And also what Souleymane pointed out. After the critique, how can we construct a positive agenda, a South-South agenda, and many comments also about the interest of prospective anthropology, and the point of being less about identity, but how the becoming. And I think this relates also to what we promote in when we talk about strong sustainability, the third point mentioned this morning about the social construct of it again. And thank you, Pearly, for the insightful lessons you share from the fieldwork in Nepal and what could be the role of development agencies. Maybe there is a lot of questions we'll take on comments and in the room. I will use my privilege as moderator to ask for the first question, maybe to Aram and Souleymane, but please, Pearly, feel free to react as well. So how this critique of post-development and what you pointed out can precisely build or facilitate this social construct of a proposal of development pathway. And maybe, Souleymane, of what you pointed out, if you have example to share of this social construct being acknowledged locally and institutionally in local institutions to propose an alternative development pathway that indeed is not, as you pointed out, not disconnected from the rest of the world, but appropriated and indigenous. I will stop here, but maybe Aram, if you want to start, and then Souleymane, if you wish.
Yes, thank you. Now, one example that is often cited is the one I also mentioned in the text of the Zapatista communities in southeastern Mexico, where roughly 200,000 people try to live in these self-organized communities without any support of the Mexican state, and also while trying to build up alternatives in education through an autonomous school system where teaching is taking place in indigenous languages and is oriented towards the needs of the local communities and not to making a career in Mexico City, where an autonomous health system is being built up, which is a hybrid between traditional knowledge of the healers and modern knowledge of doctors that have studied at some universities, and where economic alternatives are practiced in terms of collective land rights, land that has been appropriated from plantation owners, but which has also some connection to the world market through some fair trade expert connections. So I think usually if we're talking about post-development, we're talking about these very local, small-scale alternatives. But of course, it is also about alternatives on a larger scale, which have to be built if we, as you demanded, if we actually want to try to escape from these from this global capitalism. So
thank you.
Just maybe as a brief answer.
Thank you. Souleymane,
to follow and find another example, not unlike what Aram just said, the example that comes to my mind here would of something defined internally as a priority on an African agenda, and which is susceptible of being very important for a whole region of Africa, would be the project of a green wall. This project of a green wall, a Sahelian green wall that would ideally go from Dakar to Djibouti, just trying to stop the continuous advance of the desert. Because first of all, this is a project defined by Africa, and which is obviously local, has a potential for interconnecting all these countries, their efforts, etc., but also which is global. Everybody understands that a green wall on the Sahelian border and trying to stop the advance of the desert would be a better breathing for all humanity. I mean, the reason why the whole world is celebrating the fact that Brazil is coming back to its senses about Amazon is also something that we could see here working. And so that is an example of what it would mean to really have an international project like that, meaning first between the nations of Africa and also having a global value. Of course, we see all the obstacles against that. Senegal has been doing fairly well on its part, but once you cross the border of Senegal, you have all the problems that you have in Sahel right now, jihadism, terrorism, etc., which makes it almost impossible to continue the project. But it remains on the agenda, and it gives us really, I think, an illustration of what it would be to have Africa defining their own agenda, which is an agenda of integration, of South-South cooperation, and for which connection with the rest of the world is obvious, because we can see now how much all the challenges we are facing as a humanity in general, and we have to respond to them as one human species, environmental challenges and also sanitary challenges. So that's the example that comes to my mind as a response.
Thank you, Souleymane. Pearly, since you shared your experience in Nepal, you already developed the example. I was very interested by the 4 points you mentioned as recommendation, but you had to rush a little bit on your conclusion. So let me give you back the floor on the fourth, maybe the fourth point, when you said we as development partners or the agencies. I don't dare to use the word development anymore, but let's say partners. Okay, how can we support indigenous knowledge, rights, and intergenerational learning? The fourth point you mentioned. So maybe if you want to develop that point, and if you wish, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So what I was suggesting here, of course, I think at the background is we should continue to critique development as a whole, but I'm more talking about what can be done at the moment, right? And what I was suggesting is brokering, like there are some languages that we can broker to really help to, oops, I'm frozen.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Well, we cannot anymore.
My back?
Yes, you're back.
Oh, okay. Everyone is frozen for me.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Some connectivity issue. So I will give you back the floor when your connection is more stable. Maybe in the meantime, if there is question from the floor, we can take, there is one here. And then we have some question from the audience online as well.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yes. Yes, thank you. I am Bruno Boisdin from Lille, north of France. I was very, very interested in the 3 presentations. And my question is, or my idea, I don't know, my proposal is, do you agree with the idea that actually the expression development should be reappropriated by the researchers, the NGOs, and so on, in the way that, as Aram says, development is shapelessness. And I agree with you, if we take the dominant position. But if we change the definition, we can say development is not the contrary of underdevelopment. This is a dominant concept. Development could be the contrary of envelopment. Because in French, when I give my courses in development economics, I say to my students, in fact, development is not the contrary of underdevelopment. Development is the contrary of envelopment. So when you develop, you leave your envelope, you see? And I think when you say you leave your envelope, it's very close to human flourishing, including, for example, voice, Hirschman, voice, agency with Amartya Sen, or revanche des contextes, the revenge of the context, with the French anthropologist Olivier de Sardan. So I think, of course, I don't ask you to stop criticism development, and I agree with you with the post-development. But a way to succeed in the post-development project could be to say, actually, we have only to change the envelope of the concept development, and we have to define it differently. And of course, with the work of Souleymane Bachir Diam and so on, Felwine Sarr, Achille Mbembe, all the African researchers, I only know Africa, I'm sorry. But in Africa, we have a lot of new ideas. What would you think about that? Sorry to be long.
Maybe we take a second question and then give back the floor to... I see Pearly is back.
Merci. Je vais parler en français. On est accueilli ici par l'Agence française de développement. Et donc, je vais parler des recommandations telles que Pearly les a évoquées, et puis aussi de l'ouverture que Souleymane nous a offert à la fin de cette intervention. Sur la question des recommandations, je voudrais témoigner d'une pratique d'une ONG dans laquelle je suis investi et que l'AFD connaît bien, Migration et Développement, où nous travaillons sur le désir de changement des acteurs avec qui on travaille dans le Sud. Et donc, on est dans une position extrêmement confortable parce qu'on accompagne. Alors, le désir de changement, ça ne suffit pas, il faut aussi la volonté d'agir, parce que sinon, on peut avoir 1000 désirs. Mais on est dans une position confortable à cause de ça, parce qu'on accompagne ces acteurs et on essaye de faire que, par essaimage, les choses s'étendent. Ça, c'était le premier point. Le deuxième point par rapport à ce qu'a dit Souleymane, qui m'a semblé très intéressant. Alors, bon, personnellement, j'ai passé ma vie à faire de l'économie, du développement. Tout à l'heure, on a dit est-ce qu'il y a beaucoup d'économistes dans la salle, donc moi, j'en suis. Mais je me considère comme un économiste repenti parce qu'on n'a pas quand même eu tout bon depuis 30 ans à faire de l'économie, notamment à ne pas voir que les ressources étaient limitées. Pour un économiste, c'est quand même grave. Mais par rapport à ce qu'a dit Souleymane, je voudrais témoigner justement en dehors du champ de l'économie d'un exercice prospectif absolument fabuleux qui n'est pas le fait d'un prospectiviste mais d'une romancière. C'est Leonora Miano dans son roman prospectif à 2150 Rouge impératrice qui nous donne un exemple d'une nouvelle gouvernance, de nouvelles relations entre les pays du sud de l'Afrique, d'une nouvelle relation, je dirais, au spirituel, notamment dans la gouvernance, dans une gouvernance unifiée d'une Afrique qui ne l'est actuellement pas beaucoup. Voilà. C'est juste que les romanciers peuvent parfois nous ouvrir des portes qui sont extrêmement intéressantes, même pour des simples économistes, repentis ou pas.
Merci. Thank you for this question, comments and suggestion. Maybe I will build on the first point of the person who was talking last, on the role of certain NGOs to work closely with community on the, I would say, the desirable future and how to support it. And I think this was linking to the point you were starting to make before you get disconnected. So let me give you back the floor, and then I will let you, Souleymane and Aram, react to the point that were made, in particular, the first comment on the concept of development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and sorry about that. It always has to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, I was talking about brokering in the sense of, first, we understand what the local agenda really is. And then we can, actually, there are a lot of opportunities to link what they want with existing discourses. So I used to work with UNESCO, so they talk a lot about cultural heritage, indigenous knowledge as well. So you can link that as an agenda for the local people when they are talking about, transmitting their local knowledge in their own way. So I'm basically just telling that we can connect what communities really want to a bigger goals that can allow us to claim more resources. So sustainability is very vague. It has a lot of goals, but that could be an advantage. But the fun baseline is it has to come from them. And I think there's some structural constraints of NGOs and development agencies that's donor-oriented that really need to be resolved to really prioritize what local communities want. And not all local communities know what they want. Sorry to say that, but it is through the investment in a learning environment and a collective culture, collective environment that allows them to exchange the thoughts that this kind of ideas could emerge. So I would say also invest in internal learning environment and also horizontal network that allows communities to exchange with each other. Yeah, that's the main points I have there.
Thank you, Pearly. And just before we conclude and building up on the first on the first comment of rethinking the envelope of development or the concept of development, there are two comments from the audience online and questions. A suggestion of can we use the management of common goods instead of global and or sustainable development that fail until now? What do you think about that? And what is the relevance and place of universal values in that re-questioning? I will stop there, but maybe give the floor for last comments from the three of you, maybe starting with Aram, and then Souleymane, and then the final word to Pearly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Now, with the two last comments, you already opened other discussions.
Yeah, we need
Okay.
one more day.
Okay, so to be brief, redefining the concept. I think this has been done for the last 50 years, I'd say. There have been very interesting progressive discussions, Declaration of Cocoyoc in the 1970s, and redefinitions, endogenous development, participatory development, empowering development, etc. And the effect was basically that at any time some progressives on the left came up with this concept, the World Bank says, yes, exactly. Participatory development, empowering development, we're all on your side. And basically it has always been appropriated by the major player, by the mainstream. And at the same time, there have been these discussions within the field of development cooperation, while at the same time, in the global capitalist economy, the elephant in the room, the exploitation of the global south has been continuing. So we have a net transfer, according to figures from the European Network on Debt and Development, a net transfer of 1,000 billion US dollars per year from the poor countries to the rich countries. So I think this is where we should always bear in mind, yes, concepts are important, vocabulary is important, language, semantics are important, but it should not distract us from the material conflicts that are going on. And just a few brief words on the other two comments. Yes, common goods. I think this is the debate that we need. The debate about commons and how they can democratically be managed instead of debates about how we can ameliorate or basically put band-aids on the wounds that this economic system is causing. Universal values. Now, okay, this is a difficult question. I really think I wanted to also to answer or to ask Souleymane, maybe because he was also rejecting the idea of cultural relativism. Of course, cultural relativism is a terrible thing if some old white patriarchal men are appropriating the concept and defining what this culture is about and excluding women's rights, homosexuality, whatever. But if we have a constructivist concept of culture, that culture is what the people are valuing, people's values and practices, then there's nothing wrong with cultural relativism. And then it prevents domination and violence in the name of universal values. And this is something that we are witnessing also in the 21st century. The West actually saying that in the name of humanitarian values, we have to militarily intervene in country X, Y, and Z. So, yeah, so I think a constructivist concept of cultural relativism could be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Aram. Souleymane?
Yes, thank you. About the first question on development as the country of development, I agree. The notion that somehow we should understand development through the metaphorical, biological metaphor that it carries, developing, opening up yourself, breaking your own envelope in a way, and become a butterfly out of your own envelope. So, an intransitive and reflexive use of the verb develop, which is actually the case in French. If you say se développer, develop in English, to develop would be the same as se développer in French. And in that sense, yes. Only agencies that call themselves Développement, and I'm not actually saying anything, have problem because they have a transitive use of development. Developing somebody is what doesn't make sense. So we should not just drop the word development, etc. As I said, words have less etymological petrified meanings than they have uses. So if we are clear with the genealogy of the concept, where it comes from, what kind of problems it poses, we can then use them freely and talk about development without second thought, having clarified what we are trying to do. And for the second question, I'm very happy with that also. The fact that NGOs usually working in the field are very attentive to what has been called in the question desire to change. And that is important. The idea that development, true development, is a connection with the desire to change, the principle of movement within the society itself and its future-oriented vision of where it wants to go is very important. And I'm glad about what was said also about my good friend Leonora Miano. And this is very important to remember when we talk about development and prospective anthropology, the meaning of prospective in French, foresight. Foresight or prospective is not just about prolonging trends that you see today and saying, okay, this is what is happening today. If I prolong it, this is what is likely to happen, and so on and so forth. This very mathematical, geometrical way of looking at the future by prolonging the tendencies today, the trends today into the foreseeable future. The whole side of prospective that is very French, that is coming from French philosophy. Let's remember that Gaston Berger, this French philosopher, was the father of prospective. The notion that imagination is something that plays a great role. Projecting yourself in the future, a future that you want. Of course, that projection, that imagination is not totally detached from reality. It has to do with the kind of governance you want because of the kind of governance you are having, et cetera, et cetera. But the work of imagination in prospective is very important. And I remember having participated many years ago with this French prospectivist, Jacques Giry, on a reflection on Sahel, the Sahelian region, prospective on le Sahel et ses futurs, le futur du Sahel, something like that was the title of late Jacques Giry. the work of imagination, just projecting yourself, is very important in the field of development also. And this is why cultural parameters, social-cultural parameters are so paramount in this thinking. Common goods is absolutely crucial. Thinking of development as something global, something oriented towards common goods. And more these common goods are appearing to us because we are seeing it. We cannot ignore anymore that the challenges that we are facing are challenges that we are facing as a human species, and that we have to give a new meaning to the old notion, the old concept of cosmopolitics, thinking of it as a politics of humanity and the politics of the cosmos, learning to achieve our humanity together and learning to live together on our earth that we are destroying. And this gives me a connection with the last question about universality. I agree totally with what you said, Aram, about the good use of cultural relativism, because cultural relativism has functioned as a anti-colonial thinking, because playing relativism against an imperial notion of universalism. And I call imperial notion of universalism the idea that one particular province of the world, Europe, is the natural location of universality, and that it is its mission to bring universality to the rest of the world. This overarching notion, vertical notion of imperial, of universal, is what is coming to an end, which has come to an end. Because we have to think about the universal, because of course we have common challenges to which we have to respond. We have to imagine common goods. We have to so we have to project a horizon of universality, but we can only do that if we start first and foremost with the plurality of the world. And that is the post-colonial vision of what universality is, not a vertical universality, overarching universality coming from a region of the world that defined itself as the natural location of the universal, but a universality of encounter, the horizontality that all three of us actually have used that concept of horizontality, and it is not coincidental thinking about post-development. So a lateral or horizontal universality is the task ahead of us, given the challenges that we have to face together. And I believe that that is the way to go.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring last word. And Pearly, you have the very difficult task to conclude in 1 minute, please. I know it's an impossible challenge. Thank you. The floor is yours.
So after listening to all these comments, I still thought about the word power. So when we ask all these questions, we are asking in the context of existing power relation. Should we change the language? Yes, we can change the language. But for local people, it was still like, oh, there's another language they came out with. So let's find how they can inform us and how we can exploit it for our own advantage. Common goods. I love that idea, but with different political system, I don't know what that means. But I would go back to what I say about localization. If we can invest in developing, cultivating, or maintaining financial, human, natural capital at the local level, whether it is commons or it is not, I think that was promising. At least it's in the right direction. And then about universal values, once again, it's about power relations. Whose universal values when we say universal values? How do we come up with a universal values? And again, I want to say that like human rights, when it came out, there was a lot of opposition from anthropologists because of cultural relativism. But after that, they saw that, oh, they could actually help to redefine human rights to help the people that they want to help. So they come up with indigenous rights, right to development. So I think I'm talking all this in a practical terms because we are still talking all of this in a global power structure. So for me, it's more about how do we take advantage of whatever revision the powerful are making for the powerless.
Thank you.
I try my best.
No, thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Let me give applause to our three participants. Pearly, Pearly, Aram, and Souleymane, we definitely leave the session, but with a lot of food for thought as a development agency as well. Now I dare to use the word, being more informed about its meaning. Thank you. And we will surely continue our engagement. And thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Thank you again.